now more than ever, people need to go within and plug into that cellular memory, plug into divine source, detach as much as possible from the matrix. A lot of these people that have all these abilities, who have celestial star ancestry, they're operating not only throughout this cosmos, but in higher planes, and they're working against the Draco Empire. The photonic energy and the cosmic rays will activate our higher centers. And it's incumbent upon us to ride that frequency wave.
Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you are listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, our very special guest is Peter Little. Peter Little is a health politics advocate and lawyer, primarily fighting big pharma corruption in Australia since 2011, its impact on the political and regulatory framework, and its involvement in an alleged conspiracy to harm the natural medicine profession and their practitioners and patients. He recently assisted a health practitioner succeed in maintaining his right to practice in the longest health practitioner case in Australia, fought to the bitter end after 66 days of hearings before the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Peter Little has had various business and legal careers, starting with private legal practice in 1978, principal legal officer with the National Companies and Securities Commission in 1983, stockbroker and venture capitalist from 1983 to 2000, horse breeder and racing until 2010, medicinal herb farming and permaculture design, and now specializing in health politics, advocacy, and law.
And without any further ado, let me bring in Peter Little. Peter, how are you?
Yeah, great. Another great day fighting pharma corruption, James. Great to talk to you.
Yes. And we're really pleased to have you on here, Peter. And so let's dive right into it. Let's get to the meat of the question here, the heart of the question. In your view, why are all vaccines unavoidably unsafe?
Well, pretty simple reason. By reason of an act of Parliament in 1986 in the United States of America. And at that point in time, we almost had the complete breakdown of the manufacturing of vaccines because they had caused such absurd levels of damage. The courts were finding liability for negligence to the point where no manufacturer wanted to produce them. And in fact, this act is called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. And if any of your listeners want to understand it a bit better, there was a Supreme Court case which describes it. This is in 2010. Case, if you Google it, Bruesewitz, Bruesewitz v. Wyeth, W-Y-E-T-H. And they, in 2010, described the whole history leading up to the US government creating this Childhood Vaccine Injury Act and the vaccine compensation payments that have been going for 30 years. And the quote on the first page, if you can find that on Google, and maybe you could put up a link to your site, says halfway down the first page, most importantly, this US Act eliminates manufacturer liability for a vaccine's unavoidable adverse side effects. I think the big punchline came in the lobbying process. We all know how good Big Pharma is at lobbying. And at page 2 of the opinion of the court, there's this is a 2010 court case I just mentioned, referring back to that period in 1985 in the US, it said that the explosion in product liability legal actions in the US for the manufacturers of the DTP vaccine, which is causing a massive epidemic in Australia right now, by the way, that actual increase, it was increased from 3 lawsuits a year in 1978. It hit 200 lawsuits in the year 1985. And the quote from Liddell Laboratories, the final manufacturer that was going to vacate the arena estimated, this is mind-boggling, its potential liability under the court system would have exceeded its annual sales by a factor of 200 times its sales. Now, that could be like 4,000 times its profit. So in other words, put simply for the masses, all US vaccine manufacturers would be bankrupt if liability for negligence and product liability was in place over there. So that tells you how much damage it's being done to human beings, and that is why they've been let off the hook, and taxpayers funding the compensation program. It's paid $4 billion in the US in the last 30 years. Pretty simple. It's the law says there's unavoidable adverse effects, and they are paying out without the need, James, to establish causation links. It's a no-fault compensation scheme. So naturally, Minister Hennessy can't read that. She's a lawyer. You've actually just made me think I should report her to the Law Institute as to why she won't quote the US Act of Parliament and a Supreme Court case that 100% conflicts with her false and misleading mantra that all vaccines are safe and effective. Take a hit for the community and we won't even give you any compensation in Australia as well.
Yes, they seem to have this magical way about them where they feel that they can just wave their magic wand and all the vaccine-damaged children, all the vaccine-damaged adults, all the children that have been killed by vaccines, they think they can just magically make them go away, Peter. Well,
they've done a pretty good job because they silence everybody and very few people are prepared to speak out. You know, there's a huge army, as you well know, James, and many of the other commentators like you that are brave enough to have these programs. There's an incredible army. I got an SMS, or it wasn't an SMS, it was actually a post on one of these secret Facebook groups that Minister Hennessy loves delving into. And this mother said, look, I'm a member of 16 separate Facebook groups addressing freedom of choice for vaccination. And she said, I counted up the members, and obviously there's some overlap. She counted up 250,000 members just of those 16 vax groups. Well, that's just in Australia. So, yeah, who knows how many mothers are crying out for help, James, and scared to speak up because Minister Hennessy will be putting the Department of Human Services there and stealing their babies or the next one or discriminating in all the myriad ways they're doing at the moment.
Well, what I've heard is that in Australia, nurses who speak out and other medical people who speak out about the dangers of vaccines are being deregistered. Is that going on?
Look, that's the dream of the CEO of the Australian Health Regulation Practitioner Agency, commonly referred to as AHPRA, AHPRA. He actually came from the WHO organisation in the UK, so he's delivering in Australia the World Health Organisation's global depopulation agenda. And so anybody that moves in Australia and breathes that anything other than all vaccines are safe and effective, they are sending notifications to those practitioners. I'm dealing with a medical doctor that's being attempted to silence him. And I'm dealing with, there's 40 nurses in encrypted WhatsApp groups. So we're wondering if Minister Hennessy is going to break into the encrypted WhatsApp group. But there's 40 nurses that have received AHPRA notifications for social media comments they've made on private, secret or closed Facebook groups. So yeah, it's no one's been before a tribunal yet. So there's a bit of a stalemate happening, and I think they've cooked themselves, AHPRA, that by trying to silence the nurses, because we've got 200,000 registered nurses, and if I was the mainstream doctors, I wouldn't be quite agitating the nurses. There's 200,000 nurses versus 100,000 doctors. There's a lot of medical error, and the nurses know where all the skeletons are buried with every doctor, so they've taken on the wrong group. Nurses care, and doctors get bribed, and I'm hoping the nurses will win the day, and we've got a solid core that are not going to be silenced. I can tell you that, James.
Well, in America, there have been a number of nurses who have, albeit anonymously in many cases, but sometimes quite publicly, they have stood up to the bullying of their peers and the bullying of the pharma medical industry, and have stated that vaccines are absolutely dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. I've seen that, and that'd be worth reposting while we're doing this, because the nurses here need to know that there is a global movement that is just had enough. And I say to the nurses here, I'm going to challenge the change. They've actually done two things, James, in Australia. They've done three things. They've stolen private information. That's number one. Number two, they've breached the Crimes Act by intimidating these nurses, the Federal Crimes Act. Number three, they've changed the actual nurses' code of conduct. It's a particular board called, let me see if I can get it right, Nurses and Midwifery Board in Australia. They've amended in the last month their code of conduct. Each profession has a different code of conduct, and they put these special social media provisions in to shut them up from talking about vaccination. So your comments about overseas are very interesting, and I put up a post on my Peter Little Facebook page yesterday. It might have been you actually, but someone sent me this post from Hong Kong, and the influenza vaccine over there, the number of nurses that are taking a vaccine has dropped from 57%. I think it hit 24%. I'm just trying to scroll through while I'm talking to you. So there's been a meteoric drop in the number of nurses prepared to take the flu vaccine, which we know from the whistleblower at the CDC's got mercury still in it, along with all the other toxic goodies. And I think the situation is pretty much the same in the UK. Someone was going to send me a post on that. I think the nurses are having a revolt taking the flu vaccine there. So anyway, we love giving it to pregnant women in Australia, mate. We're just loading up the fetuses with the flu vaccine, but the nurses won't even take it as an adult. It's bizarre.
I had a guest on recently, Janice Barcelo. She talks about in depth the horrific abuse of developing fetuses starting in the prenatal phase and on into the delivery day. And she mentions that the flu vaccine that's been given to mothers, expectant mothers, has resulted in a over 4,000% increase in miscarriages. And it's just horrific how this just continues to go on. And you mentioned earlier about how they set themselves up, protect themselves from liability. I cannot think of another industry, the car industry, the anything industry, that has so secured for themselves protection to prevent getting sued on a mass scale as the pharma industry, despite all of the proof in the form of injured and dead babies, for example, that is available. It's an inversion of reality is what's going on.
Look, James, it's beyond my wildest imagination how big this corruption is. When I got into this, it was by accident 5 years ago when I helped my hyperbaric oxygen therapy guru, who, by the way, is not only still practicing 5 years later, been invited on the International Hyperbaric Association board as a world leader in rehabilitation of disabled patients, and I wonder how many of them have been disabled because of vaccine now, which I didn't know 5 years ago. So he's going gangbusters internationally. But I had no idea when his case was set up as a test case to scare the hell out of all the natural practitioners from doing anything other than orthodox mainstream medical drug cocktails from fetus through to grave. I had no idea then. I just thought it was just part of the normal AMA lobbying, trying to get rid of chiros, all this sort of stuff. The conspiracy case in the late 1980s and 1990s in the US, the Wilkes case, W-I-L-K-S, that's pretty easy to Google. The AMA were found guilty in the US of conspiring with the chiropractors. So I thought that was the game. So I've been fighting the Friends of Science in Medicine in Australia, which is just a puppet of the US Institute of Science in Medicine, headed by Dr. Profit or Dr. Offit, whatever you want to call him. I thought that was the game, and it was only 6 months ago that I was listening to the testimony of Dr. Offit that's sitting on the website of the Institute of Science in Medicine, I think the website in the US is scienceinmedicine.org. And you can click on that, and the homepage has got a link to the testimony of Dr. Offit and 5 others, where they were presenting an absolute hanging of naturopathic doctors. And I guarantee none of your listeners will do what I did, and listen to the whole lot. If you finally flip to the end, you'll see that the testimony finished for 6 witnesses, and then the head of the tribunal immediately gave his decision, like he'd written it obviously before the testimony. Anyway, Dr. Offit said, the reason I'm having a crack at knocking over the naturopathic doctors there, we don't want anyone talking to them about vaccination. We don't want anyone to know. And so what I think is happening, James, and I've said it in Australia, I'll say it anywhere, this is a mandatory adult vaccination agenda that was created as, I think, Dr. Tenpenny has got the best way of identifying this 2010-2020 Healthy People policy. So that by the end of 2020, we're going to mandate every adult. Now, you work out the numbers, James, of the corruption we're facing. If they get adult vaccination up, Brandy Vaughan of LearnTheRisk.org, she, ex-Merck whistleblower, says that vaccines are running at about 15% profit margin, and the pharmaceutical drugs are running at about 5% profit margin. So you're getting 3 times more profit from being in the vaccine game. Then they identify that there'd be 300 million adults getting vaccinated mandatorily versus 20 million children. So you've got 15 times the market being mandated. I mean, imagine having a company and you get an influence of government increase your market by 15-fold. You're getting triple the profit. So you multiply 3 by 15, that gets you 45 times the profit that could come in if this adult mandatory thing, which the WHO organisation wants to deliver. What does that do to the stock market, James? 45 increase in profit, 45 times increase. Like, this has never happened in stock market history. And my background is the stock market. I mean, I ran 4 listed venture capital companies, and I ran 7 private limited partnerships for the cream of the industry superannuation funds. And I'm trying to get my mind around the potential increase in the stock market capitalisation of Merck. I mean, it could go up 100-fold if they win this war. 100-fold on the current share price. Now, I can tell you that the Australian company, the world leader in influenza vaccine, and the actual licensee of the Gardasil, which they then did a joint deal with Merck, that's a company listed on the Australian Stock Exchange and is now listed on the US one. I had a look at the other day. That's called CSL. It used to be the government-owned Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, but it's CSL. Share price has gone up 500% since 2010. It's a very big, forget what the damage done to the health, it's absolute explosion of money. Never ever witnessed in stock market history, this adult mandatory vaccination. So we've got a lot of enemies, James.
Well, there's a confluence of things. You have a well-known, well-documented depopulation agenda.
Absolutely.
You have the pharma cartel that has secured and protected themselves from liability, and they are pushing the government to mandate mandatory vaccinations. It's a perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
And also we saw the rollout of Gardasil and the cervical cancer vaccine not too long ago,
mm-hmm.
and we saw an explosion of children, mostly girls,
mm-hmm.
getting injured, and then in their wisdom, they want to push the cervical vaccine on boys, but hello, boys don't have cervixes. Everything is like upside down and topsy-turvy with these people.
Well, it wasn't that they wanted to. They actually started in Australia. We're a world leader in corruption. We are so far better at corruption in Australia than the USA. I mean, your US Justice Department's collected about $30 billion, and you've got a Whistleblowers Act where you hand out up to 25% of the goodies to the ex-farmer rep that puts 10 years of his life towards being a whistleblower. We don't pay no compensation. We have no whistleblower act. There's not one regulator that's ever taken on a corruption case, and we've exempted the big pharma from our trade practices law and let them set up a self-regulatory organisation called Medicines Australia, a fraudulent body run only by the pharmaceutical industry, where the consumer has no right to complain. So that's how bad it is here, man. Out of control.
Now, the Australian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration is, I think it's called the Therapeutic Goods Administration.
Correct.
And they're the ones that basically regulate what comes into the country. For example, if someone in Sydney, let's say, wants to order Laetrile, vitamin B17 from abroad, they have to basically petition or ask permission from TGA. And often it's not that nothing comes of it. So there seems to be this effort on the part of TGA to prevent things from coming into Australia the same way that the FDA roots out natural health practitioners in America and prevents healthy supplements and whatnot coming into the U.S.
Yeah, no, it's the same game. They're all there's plants everywhere. Most of the key people running all the regulatory bodies can be traced back to the WHO, World Health Organization. The head of our National Health and Medical Research Council is the same. Everywhere I look, the background of people that are sitting on these advisory committees or boards or councils ends up being linked back into the global depopulation agenda. It's a very, very good strategy they've got, and very difficult to beat, because everyone that wants to have a crack, gets absolutely intimidated, and they've got no money, and they know they're up for 10 years of hard yakka, with these guys that are military trained for 60 years. I mean, you talk about military training, the biggest litigious company that I've spotted is Johnson & Johnson. And try and find the background of the CEO. The best thing I can come up with is his army training, killing people. So he's got 60,000 lawsuits. It'd be nice if we had pharmaceutical companies run by people that had proper healthcare sentiments, but certainly not happening.
Could you give the listeners an idea of what a natural health practitioner has to endure once they're basically found out?
Well, I'll tell you what happened last Friday, okay? I booked to go to the annual Australian Skeptics National Convention held Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday. Paid my money on the Thursday, and then on the Friday there was a free day which they called, this is at the University of Melbourne, our number one university, the home of the influenza vaccine research, I might add as well. So I got an email at the start of Friday morning that I'd been black banned to go to the convention on the weekend. But the free event on the Friday, starting 10 a.m, 8-hour session through to 6 p.m, a skeptic training camp, I just walked in and nobody questioned me. So I sat for 8 hours and got the in-depth, along with about 100 other skeptics, 5 international skeptics that do over natural therapies, 5 of the biggest guns that exist, and then the Australian gun that's responsible for the bulk of the complaints against natural practitioners you referred to me in the question, gave at the end of the day his talk. Now, his name is Dr. Ken Harvey, Harver. He's at Monash University, which is our number 2 or equal number 1 university. He entitled his training course for us, a 1-hour training course, Whack-a-Mole Project. And he had 2 of his students. He gets the whole of his classroom involved. He's teaching public health. Naturally, he's part of the WHO organisation. He's part of his CV, so he's delivering on the World Health Organisation agenda too, James. So he's educating these undergraduates on how to go to a website of a natural practitioner. And he went through, in this occasion, first time I've seen it, a pharmacist. So they're now having a crack at all the pharmacies because they're selling the natural products. So he put up Gerald Quigley, a well-known pharmacist in Victoria, Australia, who actually also has a very popular radio spot. So they're obviously worried about anyone in the media actually telling people about vitamins and minerals. So he explained probably for half an hour how they stitched up Gerald Quigley with complaints to the AHPRA organisation I mentioned before that also regulates the pharmacist. And so they were dissecting the website for claims. They were looking at PubMed articles to students to see where the claims conflicted with the science, and they were looking at the peak gold standard evidence accepted around the world as at least the best possible evidence, and that's the Cochrane Review, COCHRANE.org, a brilliant website to search for anything your mum and dad and friends are getting in terms of drug cocktails or whatever. So that's what's happening, and he bragged. This is Dr. Ken Harvey, who on the following Sunday, just a Sunday just gone, the convention I was banned from attending, he was given the annual prize for the #1 skeptic of the year. And he coins his training program the Whack-A-Mole Project, and you can actually download an app I've done since a 1975 Mattel game, which you can play to see just the mentality that's driving the agenda against natural practitioners, so that any natural practitioner that bobs up, they want to whack them. So they're calling them moles, and B, they want to whack them the minute they open their mouth. And so the whole process is a simple process, bragging that he could do 150 websites in 2 days, James. 2 days. That's the volume he can get through to create complaints. And by using the students to comb every line, every word, every possible claim in a website, every other utterance of that natural practitioner, then refer to the mainstream orthodox PubMed articles to see if it conflict with that evidence base of science, and then finally the gold standard Cochrane.org, COCHRANE.org medical review, systematic review of evidence. They go through that as well, and then they create a complaint. And in Australia, he was educating us on a couple of areas I didn't quite realise. There's a TGA, the one you mentioned before, Therapeutic Goods Administration, have a advertising advisory panel. So I might have a bit of fun of that in the new year. You might turn the tables. In addition, there's the TGA itself. You can complain direct to them. You can complain to the ACCC, which is our Australian Competition and Consumer Tribunal. And then you can complain to AHPRA, regulating the practitioners. And you can also now complain in each state of Australia. We've introduced state-by-state acts, all different, and with fairly similar mandatory codes that tackle the natural practice. So what they're trying to do, I know practitioners have been taken on in at least 2, sometimes 3 different jurisdictions in the one time, just to increase their legal costs, the sheer degree and enormity of compliance. It's a mind F, strategy, so that they lose track of their business, they become unprofitable. They're just trying to any tactic at all to destroy the practice of natural medicine, particularly the practitioners that have primary care influence over mothers that are at the vaccination stage. It's very much driven by eliminating chiropractors, naturopaths. They're cracking down now big time on the Chinese acupuncture. They're going to try and abolish that. They've had a massive go at homeopaths. They've virtually created a situation in Australia where no student is going to study homeopathy because of the hatchet job they've done on that the last 5 years. And they've even passed a incredibly corrupt review done by our Peak Medical Health and Medical Research Council, where they concluded there is no clinical efficacy to support any natural practice in Australia, and that will be used against all of the natural practitioners in these new state-by-state health complaints law. We've got one in Victoria about to start on the 1st of February. So it's a comprehensive, high-volume, mainstream university driven by doctors masses of young, vulnerable students that have got to just toe the party line because the Professor Harvey or Dr. Harvey is going to mark their exam papers. It's obscene. It's satanic. It's going to stop.
Yes, it will. Peter Little's website is fightpharmacorruption.com. So essentially what they're doing, the way you described it, Peter, is they're teaching these university students to be a horde of trolls, basically. And they've been indoctrinated, imbued with this kind of fervor, and then they turn them loose to go scour the internet and look for people who basically are not doing what they're supposed to do and going against the party line and promoting natural healing modalities.
Correct. And of course, the rationale for... and by the way, Ken Harvey, Dr. Ken Harvey, who presented at the Skeptic Convention, he's an executive member as well of the Friends of Science in Medicine in Australia, which is a puppet of Dr. Offutt's Institute of Science in Medicine in the US. Both have the same website addresses, scienceinmedicine.org in the US and scienceinmedicine.org.au in Australia. And I went to do a Facebook search of Dr. Ken Harvey, and guess who's one of his friends, Dr. Offutt. So it's all part of the same agenda, incredibly well organised. And then the Skeptics organisation, there's Dr. Harvey again getting the Skeptics Award. And then I went on to the Young Skeptics Facebook page that night to explain why I was banned and to put up the letter I said, which was I would abide by all their code of conduct. I mean, my only previous discussion of the topic is to be unbiased in the use of the gold standard Cochrane evidence. That's what I'm sceptical about. Why are they not using it in mainstream medicine to make mainstream medicine accountable? Why are they only using the Cochrane evidence? That was why they banned me. This is the skeptics from attending the formal convention. So even the skeptics are caught up in the conspiracy. And then we have another, I say it's an arm of government, but it purports to be independent, goes under the byline of Reasonable Hank, and he's been doing a lot of the notifications as well, separately. He's been found to have conspired with Minister Hennessy, and I put stealing secret Facebook pages and then turning them into tweets and working with Minister Hennessy, and I put a complaint about him with Minister Hennessy to our Corruption Commission in Victoria. So you're talking about universities, you're talking about the media, you're talking about every health minister, you're talking about every limb of every regulator. There is nowhere I turn. Indeed, all of the not-for-profits as well, James. There's hundreds and hundreds in Australia, and they're all being riddled with pharmaceutical influences, and then they get away with murder, what they say in the public arena as well. Everywhere I look, they've got plants and spies, right through the whole natural practitioner association, supposed to be representing the practitioners. I've uncovered spies in all of those. There's widespread corruption inside the actual associations themselves, and all the prackies are being left high and dry. No one's protecting them, and they have no idea what's going on. You know, they're just powerless.
It's a state of siege. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Is this the same Dr. Offutt who said something to the effect that a child can receive 10,000 vaccines all at once and it would be perfectly safe, or was that some other whack job?
No, you've got the right man, and of course, when you get a Minister Hennessy working in on a conspiracy with Dr. Offutt, you get even a more ridiculous situation. So it'd be very good if you could link the Facebook Live I was doing when I was black banned from the convention of the skeptics, because one of the things I was talking about when I was black banned doing a Facebook Live, I might add, and then I was kicked out into the courtyard. I was allowed to go to the courtyard, so I did another Facebook Live, and then I got evicted from the courtyard, which was on part of the Melbourne University property, by the police. And I was trying to track down the Dr. Offutt quote that was referenced by Minister Hennessy on her website. Now, I'll read this out, and hopefully you can have a link on your site. This is on the website of the Victorian Health Department under the byline of the Better Health Channel. And the question posed on this information guide was, can vaccines overwhelm a child's immune system? And the answer, according to Minister Hennessy, was no. A child's immune system could manage 100,000 vaccines at once. 100,000 vaccines at once. And then the reference on the Victorian Government's website is to the textbook, Vaccines textbook, the main well-recognised textbook, 6th edition, by Plotkin, Orenstein, and of course Dr. Offit, the one you mentioned. So our minister's saying that you've seen somewhere where Offit said 10,000, and I think he said antigens, not vaccines. We've turned it out in our Victorian health system into 100,000 vaccines at once, and then some bright social media gun worked out, well, I think there are 50 mil injections into your muscle when you're a 2-month-old baby. So if you got, instead of getting 8 under our schedule in Australia, if you got 100,000 vaccines at once, that worked out to 50 litres being injected by needle into the muscle of a 2-month-old 10-kilogram baby. Total nonsense. I mean, 50 litres is equivalent to 50 kilograms, I think, James. And so I highlighted that when I was being booted off Melbourne Uni, prevented from going to the bookshop to order the vaccines textbook because that was on the university property, and also they refused that I could go to the library to look at an existing textbook in the library to get this page reference 1,470 so I could see what Minister Hennessy was up to on the weekend. And then 2 days later, after me being banned from double checking the references, last night we're all checking and she's removed it from the website. So she's had another huge blow. So she's had the show us your tweets saga where she forged all the secret Facebook comments between mothers crying out for help, converted that into vile tweets from anti-vaxxers, and now she's taken off her website 100,000 vaccines at once, referencing to the great Dr. Offit. I mean, we're all wondering, when is the public going to wake up to what Minister Hennessy's saying? When are they going to realise they're unavoidably unsafe and Minister Hennessy should be in jail?
We're dealing with a bunch of pathological liars and psychopaths. She should take 100,000 vaccines at once, and we'll see how she fares after that. Now, another thing that's come to my attention, Peter, is in America, they call, when someone loses their job, they're made redundant, whatever the case may be, they sign up for what's called unemployment insurance. Basically, they get, a small, barely livable amount of money to hold them over for the next fortnight. In Australia, parents, and increasingly single parents, get some kind of payment for basically being a parent. Now, I've come to understand that the system is making it contingent upon these parents that they must allow their children to be vaccinated, otherwise their benefits will be stripped from them. Is that what's happening?
The saga, I think actually the government coined this name, the no jab, no pay. I think it was actually the government initially. Started on 1 January 2016 this year, so we're nearly up to the first 12 months of it, and that's quite right. There were 3 social welfare benefits that mothers and families were able to access that were removed if the child was not following either a catch-up schedule or following the specified immunisation schedule. So it included virtually the whole schedule that they're recommending. There was just a couple that weren't on this particular one, but they weren't mandating the flu vaccine. So it was cleverly done. They think it sort of got around all the rules, not mandatory, not this, not that. I say it hasn't got around the law of blackmail. To me, when I looked at the criminal code, different criminal code in each state in Australia, but very similar around the world, it met the test of blackmail, that unless you do something, you're going to lose, we're going to take some money off you. So I think it's still a crime. There is a move by the Australian Vaccination-Skeptics Network to do a High Court case. I haven't heard how that's going for a while, but challenging the constitutional side, but I think it's a criminal act that no jab, no pay, and a private citizen might be me. When I've got spare time, we can test out whether it offends the law of blackmail. And I wonder in the background, James, I've often said in Australia, I've been pretty vocal for 12 months, maybe we shouldn't go quite so hard on Minister Hennessy because she could have a gun at her head. I mean, she might have had her life threatened. She might have had her children threatened. We don't know what tactics, how sick the tactics are to threaten these politicians. We all know they're lining their pockets to get elected, but, if they are prepared to do death threats and things, and potentially kill natural doctors in the US or, that whole horror, stories we hear, maybe the politicians have been threatened and maybe they take those threats seriously and they feel their hands are tied whether they like it or not.
Yes, and they may have been threatened, blackmailed. There's no telling what kind of dirt they might have dug up on these people in the meantime to make them compliant. Another thing that you mentioned also was the role the universities play in this, the indoctrination that begins at the universities. In America, they have medical education, so-called. I used to work in a medical education department in a very large hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, and even then, I saw, they call them residents over there, doctors in training, and I saw the brainwashing going on, and it was like so many of the young residents already had their egos activated, they already had a God complex going on, and I'm sure something along those lines is going on as far as Australia, where the universities are essentially indoctrinating these people, to these students, to become basically attack dogs. For the system.
Yeah, look, it's like everything in the capitalist system, and look, I can't complain. I was at the cutting edge of the capitalist system when I did 15 years of stockbroking, venture capital, but the problem is that the taxpayers are not prepared to fund education to the extent that you can run universities. So the universities are in a very difficult situation that they need to get the money from somewhere. So they're getting money thrown left, right and centre to do their buildings and do this and do that from the drug industry. I mean, if we take that away, are we going to give them the money from the taxpayers' pot? Now, I would say we would have plenty of money to give them because we're spending in Australia $150 billion a year on health, if you include the federal, state and whatever else. That's the last figure I saw somewhere that nobody's challenged me on for a while. I mean, it may well be that by stopping this epidemic of polypharmacy or multiple drug cocktails, which is happening now, vaccines are drugs as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's just a sexy name, but if we stop doing this nonsense, then maybe the health bill might be $75 billion instead of $150 billion. And so we've saved $75 billion. Well, that's enough to build buildings at universities and to drop all the university fees, so they don't have to take the bribes. But, it's well known that each university has a major backer from the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, I know who the backer is for my old university, Monash, where I did a Bachelor of Economics, 73 to 75, and a Bachelor of Law, finished that in 78. It's a very big drug company, I'm told, has virtually got that university pretty tied up. So other people will squeal and say, I can't say that, but I've got plenty of whistleblowers these days, James. So one day we'll be proving it all in court, the flow of money.
Yes, and if the money is coming from the pharma cartel to the universities and also funding so-called scientific studies in the universities, obviously the results of these studies will be skewered to benefit the big pharma agenda. It's a vicious circle, a vicious cycle that we can't seem to break out of.
That's right, and the irony, I'll try and get the exact quote up while we're talking, but the irony of what happened to me when I was evicted from Melbourne University, which is the home of the influenza vaccine science, really, one of the world's greatest influenza scientists, Professor Anne Kelso, graduated recently to be the CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council. So she was a beneficiary of a $14 million grant in 2014, for example, to do some further studies on influenza vaccine, right? Lo and behold, the next year she gets appointed to be the CEO. And of course she's had a long history with WHO. And I was in the courtyard being kicked out from the skeptics because I keep mentioning Cochrane reviews that embarrassed them. And right at the point I was talking about the Cochrane review for influenza in children, a policeman turned up. And I was reciting the conclusion. I might even be able to find it here. I'm just right on the site. So you've got to go cochrane.org, and then it's Vaccines for Preventing Influenza in Healthy Children. It was published on the 15th of August 2012. The authors were Jefferson, etc. And the conclusion I was reading at the time of being evicted, influenza vaccines are efficacious in preventing cases of influenza in children older than 2, but little evidence available for children younger than 2. There was a difference between efficacy and effectiveness, blah, blah, blah. No safety comparisons, James, could be carried out, emphasising the need for standardisation of methods and presentation of vaccine safety data in future studies. Blah, blah, blah. It was surprising to find only one study of an inactivated flu vaccine in children under 2 years, given current recommendations to vaccinate healthy children from 6 months of age in the USA, Canada, parts of Europe and Australia. If immunisation in children is to be recommended as a public health policy, large-scale studies assessing important outcomes and directly comparing vaccine types are urgently required. The degree of scrutiny needed to identify all global cases of potential harm is beyond the resource of this review. Blah, blah, blah. Then I was reading this final punchline. I can't remember ever seeing a Cochrane review that almost accused the main influenza vaccine scientist, one of whom is now running our entire immunisation handbook. I was reading this out when I got evicted. The review showed, this is a Cochrane review, that reliable evidence on influenza vaccines is thin, but there is evidence of widespread manipulation of conclusions and spurious notoriety of the studies. The content and conclusions of this review should be interpreted in the light of this finding. So there we have the world's greatest influenza vaccine scientist being promoted to be the CEO of Australia's Department of Health, I'll read it out, National Health and Medical Research Council, and one person has the responsibility to approve the guidelines are going out to all the doctors. This is the same influenza vaccine. Professor Anne Kelso is the CEO. She has the power under the National Health and Medical Research Council Act 1992. I am a lawyer, Section 14A, Professor Kelso, to approve the guidelines in the Australian Immunisation Handbook. And we have the independent body saying there is widespread manipulation of conclusions of scientific research done. And so when we get a day off, James, we'll get every study that Professor Kelso has been involved in and go through it in minute detail as to why Cochrane thinks these studies have been manipulated. And we may find William Thompson sitting inside our equivalent of the CDC. It's the equivalent of the CDC we're talking about. And it's a very scary concept. So guess what happened when I looked the other night after being evicted? I got back onto the website where I spotted that Professor Kelso had got a $14 million grant in 2014 herself to do more research, then gets appointed in 2015. I wanted to find out what happened to the money. So I've gone back into the database on the NHMRC website, which you can Google pretty easily, NHMRC, I think it's .gov.au. And lo and behold, I couldn't find the $14 million grant. So I thought, what's going on here? So Then I did another sort, and I found that it's been awarded to another individual. So I'm fascinated to see the paper trail of how the current CEO got a $14 million grant, then didn't get it, and then someone else got it. And what are the credentials for the someone else to get it? And are their credentials as good as Professor Kelso's, and who approved all that?
It sounds like a shell game where they're just moving the money around just so there's no accountability, but somebody's profiting from it. In the time we got left in the first segment, Peter, can you tell a bit about the creation of Medicines Australia? We see this a lot in America where we have these phony front agencies, if you will. WebMD is a classic one on the internet, where it's the go-to site for anyone who wants to find out about medicine or the adverse effects of pharmaceuticals, whatever, but it's owned lock, stock, and barrel and put up by the pharma cartel.
Yep.
Now, something along those lines has happened with the creation of this Medicines Australia group. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's probably something I know more about than most, because I had and I haven't said anything about, or I've only touched on it, I've barely touched on my involvement with Medicines Australia back in August last year, 2015. What I was doing then, James, my mother, now passed on this year in May, my mother, June, was put in at the age of 88, a dementia home, beautiful house called Lovell House in Caulfield, and 0 drugs. 6 months later was on 8 drugs, paralysed in a wheelchair after being the best walker in the home. And I wasn't involved in the medical side, partly because my well-known views. And I thought I did get the chemist's prescription, and on it I noticed 2 antipsychotics, 2 antidepressants, a painkiller, antibiotic, and a few other bits and pieces. When I searched the antipsychotics, which alarmed me a bit, I found Risperdal was one, the Johnson & Johnson product. If you go to the FDA, very, very rarely do the FDA do any research, from my knowledge. I mean, they're normally just reliant on the manufacturers. But on this occasion, I think it was 2003 maybe, the FDA did research the evidence supporting the use of antipsychotics for dementia patients. The main reason using them because dementia patients get a bit irritated and they like to nuke them, so they're easy to manage, and presumably the staff levels are down. However, the FDA, similar to what we had with the Vioxx scandal with Merck, found that the stroke risk of giving an antipsychotic to an 88-year-old or whatever dementia patient increases the mortality risk, and on that basis they failed to ever approve Risperdal in the US for US mothers and fathers. So what did Australia do? And they went one step further, James, and this is the biggest massive litigation time bomb we'll be focused on next year, starting with Risperdal I'm talking to you about. In the US, and you can even get it on the Johnson & Johnson website, there is a black box warning, and it's the same on the consumer document with the FDA. Black box, serious warning, adverse death risk. In fact, I probably got it almost at my fingertips. I had it before. I'll try and find it anyway while we're talking. And it said, not approved for dementia and carries a increased mortality risk. So what did Australia do? Our Ministers for Health approved it in 2005, I think it was, with no warning, full stop. And it's been given like lolly water to our dementia patients, possibly more than the majority of them, and now dementia's gone to be the second biggest killer. And when I got my mother paralysed off the wheelchair, paralysed in a wheelchair, we weaned her off it, when I realised that, my dad couldn't believe it, he was 93 at the time, how a doctor could give a banned USA drug with a death risk to his wife of 66 years, he couldn't believe it. And when we got her off it, 2 weeks later, I got it recorded, James, I did not assist her. She walked 24 minutes non-stop. And then lived another year and a bit until I gave her a flu vaccine back in May, and then within about a week or 2 weeks, I'll have to double-check, it hasn't been politically correct to double-check yet, but she was in palliative care and she died 11 days after palliative care. So I say the flu vaccine finished her off.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Peter. It's such
it's a gift.
Tragedy.
It's a gift.
Yeah.
I mean, I've learnt more from my mother, and I'm adopted, and she's been a brilliant mother, and I've had a brilliant father, but I learnt more in the 2 years about the medical system from tuning into my mother's every behaviour and murmur of words and whatever. I've learnt more from that experience than anything else.
Well, we can always take a negative and turn it into a positive. So I'm really glad you had that special relationship with your mom. Now, the Black Box Serious Adverse Event System, it affects approximately 700 pharmaceutical drugs, but it seems that the warnings that are being provided by the Black Box Serious Adverse Event System are being systematically ignored. Does that seem to be the case?
Well, let's be pretty clear, because I probably wasn't clear with you beforehand. The black box warning system applies in the United States. It does not apply in Australia, and I'm advised by the Minister for Health, and I haven't double-checked it, this is the Commonwealth Minister for Health, Susan, I call it Ley, but I heard someone else pronounce it Lee, but it's L-E-Y, Susan Lee. She, when I was complaining about this Risperdal drug to her and through my electoral representative, which was Mr. Greg Hunt. Back then he was the Environment Minister, now he's been demoted or promoted or whatever to the Science Minister. I was advised in a letter from Minister Ley back July last year that we do not follow the black box warning system in Australia at all. The reason I know... So I don't know how many drugs in the US have a black box warning. I don't know how many. I've written to the FDA and they wouldn't tell me. An organisation, however, provided me with a list in Australia that they've systematically put together of the drugs being marketed in Australia that they've identified in the US have a black box warning. So that's why I mentioned that I've got a list of 700 that I want to go through, and then there could be potentially 700 separate class actions for why we are not getting the black box warning in Australia, and why, from an informed consent viewpoint, the medical doctors are not aware of the black box warnings, or if they are aware, why are they not warning the patients of that? Now, the second biggest time bomb is the Ritalin one, which is close to home, on another topic. And that's fed like lolly water to all the school children. That has a massive black box warning in the US that can lead to major drug dependence. And I can guarantee one day I will be able to demonstrate with honest scientists that the epidemic of ice is linked to the epidemic of ADHD and ADD, which they're giving the Ritalin and the related products. And then I'm confident we can then link back the ADHD syndrome to the vaccination escalation as well, so that we have a whole chain cascade reaction from the time you nuke a fetus and a mother, and potentially the mother's breast milk, when she finally pop out, and then you nuke the kid, with 10 to 15 to 20 times what I got. And then you put them on all the crap through school, and then you give them all the antidepressants, and then if they've still made it into society, they're not, on social welfare being called dole bludgers, they'll end up with early stage dementia, and then we'll kill them with Risperdal. I mean,
Yeah, it's really a depressing Luciferian system. Well, we've reached the end of the first hour. You've been listening to Peter Little talking about what's been going on as far as the big pharma corruption in Australia and how it guides and controls levers of power in Australia. Peter Little's website is fightpharmacorruption.com. And if you like what we do here at the Cosmic Switchboard, if you believe in what we're doing, please go to our website, thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member. In the second hour, we're going to have Peter talk about the extent of medical kidnapping cases in Australia, and as well as the long-term objective that he has as far as his advocacy is concerned. So you've been listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show, and we will see you at the top of the next hour.